yes, as a designer, I would want to encourage people, whether you are a designer or not, to go and spend a good chunk of time, at least a couple of weeks, if not more, in isolated extreme environments with very little input and interaction and connection to the outside world. To go travel to the Arctic or to Antarctica or to the big grand desert that's nearest to you, like it could be Kutch, it could be Thar, it could be the Mongolian desert, and live off the land.
This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world.
Space architecture is an invented discipline. I'd say in the late 80s, early 90s, a couple of American architects who were involved in space projects started to lobby for space architecture to become a recognized professional discipline within the American Institute of Architects and later within the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which is AIAA. I would say from the stories I've heard, it took a good decade and a half or even more to convince the engineers at the AIAA that space architecture can be a relevant and a legitimate discipline in itself, because there was a lot of pushback from the engineers. If you look at space architecture, which I often refer to as spaceship design, because sometimes people mistakenly think space architecture is about designing only just the interiors of a spacecraft, a human spacecraft. It goes way beyond just the interiors, because we space architects, again, it's a small fraternity around the world, not only design the outfitting of a habitat, for example, a human habitat for outer space, we also work on systems engineering. We work through all aspects of human factors, habitability factors, whether it's food or hygiene or sleep or air quality. So I think there's a very good left brain, right brain play when it comes to the profession of space architecture. I'd also like to add that none of the government space agencies, whether it's NASA, the European Space Agency, the Japanese, the Indians, none of them have openings, job openings for space architects or industrial designers, which is a pity, if you ask me, and which we have been pushing for a long time. So most of them who choose to then work for space agencies end up becoming a part of the systems engineering kind of thing. However, that's starting to shift now that we are seeing new space companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, who go out and hire, Virgin Galactic for that matter, who go out and hire some of the finest designers, whether it's your interface designer for the cockpit display, or your seating, or the environmental control bubble that the humans are put into, whether it's on a launch pad in a rocket or in orbital space. So what I'm trying to say is now we are starting to see a shift where the importance of designers and architects is you don't have to sell it or pitch it to these guys anymore. Because if you and I are going to pay for a ride into outer space, we want our ride to be comfortable, just like in a commercial jetliner. Let me take the other part of your question, Kedar. So in 2004, Barbara Imhoff, my dear friend and co-founder of the Vienna company that we co-founded called Liquifa, we initiated a book project, which was funded by the Austrian Chancellery of Art. And it's well known in the space architecture circles as the Silver Book on Space Architecture. And we invited a bunch of authors, writers. And one of the chapters is where we got together and defined these three genres of space architecture. So the first one, Voyage d'Esprit, is essentially the genre where space architecture ideas were discussed in science fiction books and science fiction films, a lot in the 60s, I would say, and even before that, whether you're looking at 2001: A Space Odyssey, or you're looking at Ikari XP1 or Solaris, films, and then a lot of the books from Asimov to Clarke. The second genre, man in a can genre, is a genre where government space agencies built human ferries to take humans into low Earth orbit and also to go beyond, say, the moon, for example. So the genre of architecture, for example, the International Space Station that's orbiting the Earth right this very minute, would fall in that genre because these agencies took a very engineering-centric approach to design. And it's almost like humans who were put inside machines and were expected to live inside machines. And the idea of human factors, the idea of habitability being as important as safety and survivability was downplayed to a large extent because it was engineering centric. Then we move on to the third genre, which is the genre we space architects around the world now inhabit, and we call that transgravity. What do we mean by transgravity is there are many of us who design anything from habitation systems to transportation systems, exploration systems for Earth. And we also design beyond our terrestrial realm, so low Earth orbit, other planetary destinations, and hence the word transgravity. We don't want to draw a line between Earth and outer space because Earth itself is a spaceship. We are right this very moment hurtling through space and we are on a spaceship, and hence the word, transgravity. So variable gravity environments is what we're trying to say.
Got it. And as you said, where are like the designers of different subdisciplines from interface design to interior to spatial design to will sit in kind of the man in the can and transgravity, not the earlier one, or are there?
You're right. If you worked for a government agency, you would still be in a man in a can approach. But if you were working for a SpaceX or a Blue Origin, or be an independent practitioner like myself, I've started my own companies, then yes, transgravity.
Got it. Okay, and what does it take to become a spaceship designer, right, or an architect? I mean, like if you can just share, like I know before the recording we said that there's no official schools or disciplines that teach this formally, but how can one become a spaceship designer, or if somebody's interested, how can or where can they start, and then like what does it happen when they reach to your level?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to share that. So, like I said initially, that space architecture is an invented discipline, and now it's becoming more relevant with space tourism coming in, and we are looking at the moon and Mars as potential planetary destinations for human presence. So there is no straight path, which I think makes it exciting. So anybody, you could be an engineer with an interest in industrial design and architecture and human factors. You could be an ergonomist. You could be an industrial designer, an interface designer. I think you summarized it very well when you were putting the question across, or even an architect, a terrestrial architect. What is important is if you are interested in the idea of designing for extreme environments, whether it's the Arctic, Antarctica, the desert, underwater, or outer space, I think you need to figure out a path for yourself, both personally and professionally, in the geography that you're in how do you engage with that realm of design, right? So let's say I live in Bangalore and I'm an architect, and I'm interested in doing something for the Gaganyaan, the human spaceflight program that the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, is now pursuing. Then I think I would advise this person, the architect or industrial designer, to first go online and also look up books, online to read and wrap their head around the environmental conditions that you'll be designing for. Hard vacuum, variable gravity, like on Moon, you have 1/6 gravity, on Mars, you have 1/3, on Earth, you have 1 gravity. Read up on the human behavioral aspects of living in extreme environments, in isolation and confinement. There are very many simulations on simulators around the world where they mimic planetary missions. So I would advise them to read up as much as they can about human spaceflight endeavors, planetary mission simulations, environmental parameters, and then approach the space agency or a company, let's say you're in California, you can go talk to someone in SpaceX or go talk to someone in JPL and find your entry into that field, either as a freelancer or by working for that organization. And I can definitely tell you from personal experience that it's not going to be easy, quite the contrary. You really, when we, for example, started the Vienna company in 2004, the idea the founders had was to send a message to the European Space Agency and the NASAs of the world that it is time to move away from an engineering-centric approach to designing human habitats in outer space to a multidisciplinary design approach. And initially, I think there was quite a bit of skepticism on the front of the space agency. They thought, oh, we are architects and industrial designers, so we will come up with wonderful renderings and they can use it, for their PR or something. But later, when they saw that not only could we design what they thought were the architectural aspects, but also more technical stuff, systems engineering level thinking, and also build full-scale prototypes and test these prototypes in analog environments on Earth. Now they have fully understood the importance that what do architects bring and what do industrial designers bring to the design process. So I think what I'm trying to say is it's not going to be easy for anybody out there who works for terrestrial conditions to go out and work for, say, outer space projects, but it's doable. So I think you should go and meet up people within the space agency or space companies and see how you can contribute to ongoing projects and missions. So don't expect it to be a very easy entry, but I think eventually they will get around to getting a sense of how you can contribute. So it'll be an informal entry is what I'm trying to say. But there's definitely, I'm thinking of how we can set up a space architecture and design lab in Bangalore, because we will have a resident astronaut training facility coming up in Devanahalli, where the airport is, that area. And the Human Spaceflight Center is also headquartered out of Bangalore. So I want to set up a design lab where we have the resources, both physical and digital, and also the spatial resources for people to come together and design things for the human spaceflight program that India is now engaged in.
Yeah. It's quite very fascinating time. In fact, that leads me like a very nice segue to the next question, because as you said, traditionally government agencies tend to design in a very engineering centric approach, right? Like where they don't really maybe not inviting architects or designers to build stuff. I've interviewed a couple of other people from different domains in design, and they have somehow tried to form collectives within their smaller cities to influence the local municipality or something like that, right? So, but with your exposure, like with designers engaging in like a space collaboration kind of a thing with other professionals, like say physicists, engineers, biologists, these all seem to be inevitable, and hence my assumption is that the rewards are very high. So if the entry barrier is low right now, I'm assuming rewards are high. So could you talk about the rewards of these?
The rewards are not monetary, I can tell you that. The rewards are more, it's a very fulfilling, it's a very rewarding thing to be able to work. For example, my work over the last 25 odd years, I started with NASA Johnson in Houston, spent 3 months there working on projects related to the upcoming International Space Station. This is end 90s. And then there was a shuttle missions which were happening it was collaboration between Roscosmos and NASA, where they would send up American astronauts to spend 4 to 6 months on the Mir space station, the Russian space station that was orbiting then. So I got to work on projects related to these two stations. I know the Mir space station and the space shuttle, the American space shuttle, inside out. Like I can blindfold walk you through if any of them were right here in front of me. And then I went on to work for the fledgling International Space Station program at Boeing in Huntington Beach. I did not work on the design side of things, but I worked in international business development, which means I was part of a small team that would go out and bid for new contracts with the partners on the International Space Station program. We would negotiate those contracts and then manage those international contracts. We would, just to put it briefly, we would sell anything from a small space qualified fire extinguisher to anything as large as a complete pressurized module to any of the partners of the International Space Station program. So that was an inflection point for me as a designer and an engineer. So I'm also an engineer, because I got to see how business happens in the aerospace world, right? So anyway, coming back to what you were saying about how rewarding or not rewarding. So I think by taking uncharted paths, so I was pretty much the only foreign national on the Boeing site in Southern California in Huntington Beach, and had to be escorted everywhere at all times, because foreign nationals are not allowed on aerospace sites in any country. So even if you're a Canadian, you couldn't have worked on that California site. So it took 15 months of being nomadic and going through all kinds of security clearances to even get in there, right? But once you are there, I think rewarding, because I got to be inside the belly of the beast and see how the aerospace industry works, which is why it helped me to go out and then start my own little companies, right? One in San Francisco, one in Vienna, and then in Bangalore. So I would encourage designers and architects, and even engineers for that matter, to learn or expose themselves to the business side of things. How do you make things happen otherwise? So even if someone doesn't want to hire you to work for them as a space architect, you could then set up your own outfit and engage in projects, bid for projects, that, like we did through our Vienna company, Liquifer, right? We used to bid for projects with the European Space Agency. So go out and set up your own shop and bid for projects with the Indian Space Agency, for that matter, or JAXA, or ESA, or NASA. It's doable, like any other entrepreneur, and more doable today than 20 years ago when I started.
Yeah, it's very, very inspirational, because I remembered, like, I'm just connecting these two dots, because designer is all about having a goal, trying to solve a problem, making sure that somehow the outcome is very gratifying. I heard or recently somewhere read, during Apollo 11, I think, John F. Kennedy just asked the janitor, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, sir, we are sending a man to moon." So even the collective experience of
Consciousness.
being, is very, very gratifying as such.
No, absolutely. And I think since you brought in an anecdote from the Apollo era, when I was at NASA Johnson in the late 90s, I remember meeting these retired Apollo guys. And to be quite honest, there's a huge difference between the pioneers of a program and those who work for it today. Similarly, even the ISRO pioneers. So I grew up amongst the ISRO pioneers in the 70s and 80s in Ahmedabad, because the pioneers had a vision for the future, right? In the 60s, what I have heard, the average age of the NASA employee was about 26 years of age. Wow. And today, I think it's somewhere in the late 40s. So what I'm trying to say is this entire drive and this, like I said, the vision for a future, utopian or not, really brings people together. And I think I can see a similar thing happening in India right now, because we not only did we become the first country to successfully land near the South Pole of the moon, we are going to be launching humans in a year or two. There is that level of excitement, and wanting to associate with this program, even if not directly, even tangentially, indirectly. I mean, I could be a janitor and feel thrilled that the office room that I just cleaned, I just saw some posters or drawings or, heard discussions about the space program. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Contagious. Absolutely.
Correct. Yeah, we spoke about the reason of having this interdisciplinary kind of understanding. Could you also tell us a little bit about, like, you've straddled through various disciplines, right? Like design, art, tech, humanities, choreography, and bunch of other things as well. And how was it kind of growing up in the 70s and the 80s, when this ideology of having a wide understanding of, or wide appreciation having a very open palette to multiple things, despite you being say like a chef, but having a flair for Kumar Gandharva,
Yeah.
or
No, I
like.
think it's a wonderful question because I think this idea of verticals or siloing things into, for example, the American definition of STEM never appealed to me. I was a kid who grew up in Ahmedabad in the 70s and 80s, and I was surrounded by what I call the Sarabhai and Bhabha culture. So Homi Bhabha was the founder of the Indian Atomic Energy Program, and Vikram Sarabhai was the founder of the space program. And both of them came from industrial families who were engaged in the patronage of the arts and the humanities. So both Bhabha and Sarabhai not only were involved in science and technology related things, but they were very much not just interested, but engaged in things to do with industrial design, with fine arts, with performing arts. So I grew up in this culture where you never draw a line between the arts, humanities, and technology or business for that matter. So it's a sort of a Renaissance spectrum, yeah. So after Ahmedabad, when I went out, I've lived in 4 different countries. I've worked with people from very many cultures. In fact, I pushed back in the United States when this whole idea of STEM has now become so prevalent. I push back against that idea because I think it's dangerous for engineers to silo themselves into their silo and architects to be in their silo, or performing artists to be in theirs. I think it's very important to cross-pollinate. It's very important to influence each other's thinking, designing, approach to life and work. In fact, everything that I've done in the last 25 odd years, I have always been working in collaboration with people from many other disciplines. Let me give you an idea. Other than running space companies and having worked with space organizations, I've always curated, managed cultural projects. One such project in 2015, I invited a French choreographer, Kitsu Dubois, to come to Delhi. And I brought in a contemporary dance company in Delhi called Gati Dance Company to organize an underwater movement workshop at a swimming pool in Delhi. Because the idea was to give young contemporary dancers an understanding of how the human body responds to variable gravity. Kitsu Dubois, in her profession, had done amazing experiments, dance experiments underwater. She had worked with circus acrobats, and she had been on what we call parabolic flights, where we simulate microgravity, where you simulate weightlessness. When you take a plane up and down in a steep parabola, on the tip of the parabola, when you're just coming down, you experience like 25 seconds of free float. You can float. So Kitsu Dubois, in my view, has an amazing understanding of how the human conditioning in one gravity can affect how you perceive, say, 1/6 gravity on the moon, or how will your body respond, how will you translate yourself in 1/3 gravity on Mars. Because an astronaut trainer will treat you very basic things. How do I go from this wall to that wall by giving just the right amount of push, because you're in weightlessness, right? You don't want to go bang against the other wall. But Kitsu had not only an artistic understanding of how the body responds in variable gravity, but also a scientific understanding, because she had done research with people at the Imperial College in London about the human central nervous system and how it adapts. So I think this is just an example of how science meets, choreography, and dance meets space exploration, for that matter. So I think it's all, I mean, think about the universe. To me, the universe is the greatest metaphor of chaos. And in chaos, you have the most wonderful things happening or coming out of that chaos. And chaos, in a way, is an ordered chaos. There's a method to the madness.
Yes.
So never draw lines. Never put yourself in silos. And if you are in one, get out of it.
Yeah. I remember listening to one talk by Devdatta Patnaik. I don't know where he borrowed it from, but I'm really fascinated by the concept of having a forest and not really a garden, because then in garden you have STEM and you have people who define what is a garden, and then there's a gardener. while I think forest is more inclusive.
Yeah, I think Devdutt himself is fairly interdisciplinary. I mean, writer, he draws, I mean, all of his books, he's illustrated them. But anyway, the forest garden metaphor, I think I would like to just quickly bring in indigenous knowledge systems, because we human beings who consider ourselves to be part of the industrialized world or the so-called civilized world are actually not as civilized as we think. When I look at the indigenous systems, whether it's the Aborigines in Australia or the tribal tribes in India or, other
The
indigenous
Andamans, yeah.
anywhere, I think one of my dad's nurses, she comes from one of the tribes in Orissa. And it's wonderful how her community to this very day goes into the forest and brings firewood. They don't chop down trees. They just forage for firewood, for all kinds of leaves, which can be used in the cooking or for medicinal applications. So I think they leave the forest intact, right? Unlike, say, organized farming, agriculture, which in a way is one of the biggest contributors to the greenhouse thing, because we are not allowing for carbon sequestering to happen. You know what I mean? So I love what Devdutt Patnaik said. I think humanity, if it has to counter climate collapse, if it has to ensure the longevity of our species on this particular home planet, we need to go with a forest metaphor. We need to have the wild, the wilderness is a great, wonderful thing. And let's not make it too organized, and let's not monetize the hell out of everything either. Let's not over curate things.
Yeah,
so let the wilderness stay and thrive. I think I like what Devdutt Patnaik has said. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have the last question for the first part of it, which was more meta, is that what are like then, or what could be like a unique challenges and also opportunities in this sector as a designer, right? You mentioned about designing not just about spaceship interiors, but also I think one of our calls you spoke about having like long distance travel will bring in new set of challenges in terms of psychology, in terms of like exchanging the common space for like 6 weeks when you're on a flight to Mars with a stranger, right? Like
No, it's six
climate,
months. It's 6 months to
6 months,
Mars,
6 months,
one
yeah,
way.
6 months,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So and then climate is another important domain which you spoke about. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think let's talk about opportunities and challenges. Let's start with climate. Let's start with the tail end of your question. I think space exploration, not just human exploration, but also robotic exploration, is helping us understand our planet better. For example, we are planning missions to Venus, right? And Venus has what is in some ways like a runaway greenhouse effect. It's too warm. And Earth could potentially have a runaway greenhouse effect if we don't rein in climate disastrous things that we are doing, right? We could even end up being either like Venus, or we could end up being like Mars, where Mars it harbored life at one point. And then it became what it is today. So Earth I mean, it's harboring life today as we see it around us, but it might be headed that way. So I think to me, on one hand, the climate crisis, the health crisis, the environmental crisis is something we need to find solutions for in an informed manner. And I always say that the opportunity lies in straddling terrestrial projects with extraterrestrial projects. What I mean by that is there are many things we are doing here on Earth that could inform and influence how we design for off the planet living and working and exploring, and the other way around. So a lot of advances that we see on Earth today with hydroponics, for example, we will be using them in our greenhouses when we live on faraway planets, because you can't have resupply missions that easily, right? So you have to be self-sufficient. Similarly, if you look at a city like Bangalore, where every new human settlement, it's by regulation, you have to recycle all of the gray water and black water within the complex, the campus that you're living in. It's sort of a closed loop thinking that's now being mandated by law because of the environmental issues that we now
Mm.
face. On a spaceship too, we have to have closed loop life support systems. You have to more or less make sure there is as little trash as possible or no trash. Similarly, when we set up human presence on the moon, which we will in the near future, we have to have this closed loop thinking. So what I'm trying to say is the challenges of living on a planet like Earth and the challenges of living on extraterrestrial, destinations like the moon and Mars will be very similar. So never kind of isolate yourself to one realm or the other. I think one needs to keep straddling both worlds at all times. In terms of opportunities, I think we will have opportunities for everyone, for ergonomists. I think that's very important, whether it's cognitive ergonomics or physical ergonomics, interface design, both the back end and the front end. Because when you are sitting in your launch suit, or when you're sitting, or you are in a spacesuit doing a spacewalk, interfaces, whether you're wearing an augmented reality set inside your visor, or whether you are sitting in a cockpit of your human ferry, waiting to launch in Florida or Sherikota or wherever. I think it's very important to make sure that we optimize, because there are the astronaut or cosmonaut or taikonaut has to operate within very severe constraints. So I think design, I'll give you an example. Like on the International Space Station that's orbiting the Earth right this very minute, we've had a leakage problem, not once, but I think more than once. And one of the sources of the leak, so if you're in a pressurized module in the vacuum of outer space, you cannot afford to have a leak, because the moment you have depressurization, it can eventually be fatal, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, even on an aeroplane, when you're flying at about 11 kilometers or 14 kilometers from the Earth, you are in a short sleeve environment and you cannot afford to have any kind of cabin leakage, any kind of depressurization. So the reason for the leak on the space station on that particular instance was because on one of the windows, the windows are bolted to the skin of the module. On one of the windows, they had developed a leak around one of the bolts, I believe. Right? It's a very vulnerable part because the skin of a pressurized module, and you have punctured and put a window in there. Had they put handholds near the window, a very simple solution, right? Design-wise, where the astronaut floats in and kind of, because the astronaut is free floating, so they need to tether themselves either by holding onto something or by a foothold or a handhold or something. So every time the astronauts would come to the window, they would probably be holding onto a bolt to look out, which is what led to the eventual leak. So what I'm trying to say here is the opportunities are for quite literally, even psychologists, because human behavior in extreme environments, whether it's an Antarctic expedition, a submarine expedition, or a space expedition, there will be conflicts. People will fall in love. There will be psychological stresses that need to be managed, needs to be dealt with. So I think literally every field can engage. So I think in terms of opportunity, the spectrum is broad. But in terms of the number of paid jobs in companies or research organizations, that'll be very limited. It's a very niche area after all. So you need to be prepared for that. And how do you find your place in that niche is the challenge. And that's where you need to get creative and also have enough resilience to stay the course in wanting to engage.
Yeah. You spoke about the small nut bolt. In fact, I was looking at the Soyuz launch. I found
it's
during
one of
my
my
research.
favorite rockets. Soyuz is one of my favorite rockets, but go on, yeah?
Yeah. And I saw first time I actually spent some 9 complete minutes to see how they're reaching the outer atmosphere. And it just felt, I don't know. I don't have a word. For a lack of a better word, I would just say it's called divine. But within that, I could spot very clear design interventions, and I could see the difference of the kind of picturization we have in movies where they're the people are just shaking with as if there's a big earthquake, while here they felt very comfortable. Obviously there will be a pressure as such, but at least what I had seen before and what I saw in that Soyuz setup was quite different. And the center astronaut was holding a small a rod to press certain buttons on the console, right? While the others two were like reaching their hands directly. So that one
Yeah,
scene
yeah.
also gave me so many ideas as to what is a possibility and what all design interventions can happen. But I think we'll park that, and I wanted you to, because in the interest of time, if you can talk about the textile bit also, which I heard in another talk of yours,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
spacesuits carrying moon dust and things
Yes,
around that.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think just quickly on the Soyuz bit, for those who are listening, there is a Soyuz rocket and there's a Soyuz capsule, which
Mm.
ferries three astronauts, cosmonauts into low Earth orbit and back. And I've written a series of essays on human ferries for a magazine called STIR,
Mm.
STIR. So those of you who are interested in knowing more about these human ferries, past and present, I would encourage you to go and read these essays and then, research beyond that, of course. But let's
Yes.
talk about textiles. So I
Yeah.
think,
I've added those links in the show notes, by the way.
oh,
I will.
okay,
Yeah.
wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful. So I think textiles again is this fantastic realm where you have everything from the hand woven textiles to the sort of more high tech smart textiles. I remember when NASA Johnson was working on the Transhab project. So the Transhab project was a project for a future inflatable habitat for Mars exploration. So it was essentially going to be a pneumatic module, which would expand once it reaches outer space, wherever its destination is, and the inflatable walls would rigidize.
Mm.
So it would inflate and rigidize, right? And I remember NASA engineers and scientists consulting with certain textile designers in the area because it had, the pneumatic fabrics have a certain component about the weave,
Mm.
which makes them, which gives them a certain amount of strength and porosity. I mean, it's a very complex science. And they had brought in textile designers to understand what should be how should the material be designed, right?
Mm.
To play the role that it has to. Um, Similarly, when I visited the Smart Textiles section in ANSI, which is the Industrial Design School in Paris, I was telling them, I mean, you have such amazing textiles in your wardrobe, you need to play with it, right? What I mean by that is spacesuits, since you mentioned spacesuits, are one of the best design challenges because you have to think of a spacesuit like the Michelin man, you've seen the inflatable,
Yeah.
the man in the Michelin ads. So it is a reinforced piece of garment, the spacesuit. It has several layers. You start with your underwear, which has tubes carrying water in it. And the water is being circulated by a pump in the backpack of your suit because you have to keep the body cool. In outer space, you face extreme temperatures. Like let's say you're an astronaut in a spacesuit doing a spacewalk outside the space station. In 90 minutes, the space station orbits around the Earth. So half of the time is facing the sun, you're facing the sun, and then half of the time you are in the shadow region. So
Mm.
your spacesuit has to deal with extreme variations in temperature. It has to protect you from the fact that there is no atmospheric pressure. Your veins would burst. So there's a bladder of oxygen that creates a pressure on your body. You have a layer that protects you from micrometeoroids because, anything in low Earth orbit is moving at enormous speeds of about 28,000 kilometers per hour. So even a
Wow.
small thing can puncture your thing. So I think spacesuit design has undergone, certain advancements, but it hasn't gotten to a point where the spacesuit is. I mean, people are working on it. For example, Deva Newman in MIT Aeroastro department, she worked on the idea of biosuits for a while. People are working on special materials where it can be what we call mechanical counter pressure. So it is a stretchy material which can apply pressure on the human body by the virtue of you wearing it, right? So we need to go from bulky spacesuits where you are being constantly forced in this manner, like your hands in an outward manner. So you have to act against that force at all times. Even the glove is a matter that needs to be resolved a lot more from a design perspective, because it's very hard to work wearing those bulky gloves, especially when you want to do finer finger movements. And it is also because it's pressurized, you're always like pressing to use your hands. You're almost like pressing a tennis ball kind of thing all the time.
Oh.
So it's exhausting. So, and the other thing is, we are going to set up human presence on the moon, and the moon has this the big problem of lunar dust, because the dust on the moon, some places we even have like 10-20 meters of loose dust, and it's very, very sharp like glass because there are no weathering forces. And the electrostatic properties of the lunar dust, it gets onto the creases of your spacesuit, and it's also supposed to have gotten into the hermetic sealing of your suit parts. So how do you deal with moon dust, for example? Can you come up with materials where the dust stays off the suit? Maybe we don't know. We think of dust showers. We think of how you can, after a sortie on the lunar surface, the kind of habitats we have designed for the moon. We want the astronaut to come and latch its backpack onto the wall of the habitat and wiggle back into the habitat while leaving the spacesuit out, because you don't want to bring the lunar dust into your habitat. So I think textile design, or let's call it advanced material research, has a big role to play in exploration, in space exploration, especially human space exploration, and of course robotic exploration too. But from a textile point of view, I think there is a lot more research to be done in that area.
Yeah.
Huge scope for doing new
Wow.
things.
I'm just overwhelmed with like the possibilities. It's so fascinating. Cool. So we'll change tracks, and I want to conclude with actually more questions. But if you have time, it would be great to continue. We'll see where it goes. But you started, like, these are mainly towards your journey and kind of certain tips and advice that you can give us. Is that you made your first, like, you started Earth to Orbit, and later now Spaceport Sarabai. So if you can give me a quick glimpse of what exactly you folks do there, any special project, any special milestone which made you convinced that now I should come back to India, or India has huge potential.
Well, India has always had huge potential, and I like contrast in my life. I like the energy, youth, and chaos of India, and I like the linearity and sterility of the West. So I think living between both worlds has always been great. You can have your base camp anywhere, and I think India is as great a place as any. So Earth to Orbit was a company that I started in India in 2009 when I moved back. I moved back in 2008. Before that, I had co-founded two other small companies, one in San Francisco called Moonfront, which was a boutique consulting firm. That was my first company, so it was more experimental. It was more of an experiment. We had 6 partners. The second one in Vienna, which was co-founded in 2004, 2005 timeframe, Liquifer, that's still around. That company works on space architecture and design projects with the European Space Agency and with other partners. And we not only design things, we also build prototypes of habitation systems and exploration systems. We also test them in analog environments, because if we are designing something for the moon, we would test it underwater for reduced gravity conditions. If we test something for Mars, we would test it in places in Spain and elsewhere where you have Mars-like terrain. So that's the Vienna company. I was actively involved for the first 12 years. That company is still around. We just published a book that captures sort of 15 years of designing and building for living in outer space. It's a beautiful book. It's called Liquifer. It's now available on Amazon. And then the Indian company, Earth to Orbit, when I moved back, I went and visited some of the ISRO centers in India. Remember, I grew up with the ISRO pioneers because my dad was one of the pioneers of the space agency. I visited Trivandrum in the south of India to meet the team that was working on the human space exploration program. So anybody who's listening to this podcast should know that any country that wants to engage in human exploration takes a good 10 to 15 years from the day they start putting their minds together to start the program to the day they actually launch humans into outer space. So in 2008, I visited Trivandrum, met the ISRO team, tried to understand the initial crew capsule that they had tested for re-entry technologies in 2007. I also shared with them the kind of projects I did at NASA and through my Vienna company so that they can see how we approach design of rovers and habitats and what have you. I also went and visited, companies like Godrej and Vikhroli, where they make rocket engines, they make missiles. I went to Tata Advanced Materials here outside of Bangalore. So I sort of did a recon of where India is and what are we doing, both in the private industry and the agency. And I thought, okay, well, what I got smitten with was the PSLV rocket. So India has two rockets, the GSLV rocket, which is used for launching communication satellites it's a 36,000 kilometer altitude orbit around the equator. And the other one is called the PSLV, which is used for launching Earth observation satellites in what we call the sun synchronous orbit. So the PSLV rocket was first successfully launched in 1993. I left India in 1996. I moved back to India in 2008. And the PSLV rocket by then was one of the most reliable, one of the most mature rockets in its class in the world. So I thought, why not make it my mission to make it a successful rocket also from a business perspective, to make it one of the most sought after rockets by international satellite companies to launch their satellites into low Earth orbit or into SSO orbit. So I had one of my initial interns look up all the foreign payloads we had launched on the PSLV from 1999 to 2008. And the total mass of these foreign payloads was about 1,500 kilograms, which is not even equal to one PSLV launch because a standard variant of the PSLV rocket can take 1,600 kilograms into SSO and low Earth orbit. So then I co-founded Earth to Orbit, and the first 7 years we spent trying to figure out how to bring more international clients to launch on the PSLV rocket. So we helped launch a Japanese satellite in 2012 on the PSLV. We also were instrumental in opening up. I'm using the word opening up because in 1998, when India conducted nuclear tests, the United States government put sanctions on India. The US government likes to play big brother and the moral police. So because of the 1998 embargo, American companies were not allowed to sell space components to the Indian Space Agency. So launching an American satellite on an Indian rocket was simply out of question because the 1998 embargo remnants were still in place, in 2008. So it took us almost 5 years of soft diplomacy to get permission to override this embargo, break through this embargo, and get permission from the US State Department to allow for this company was called Skybox. It was a Stanford startup, and they wanted to launch a remote sensing and Earth observation satellite. So they gave us permission. Like I said, I must have met more than a dozen diplomats in those 5 years. So we started talking to the US State Department in 2009. And in 2014, we signed a launch agreement between our launch client, Skybox, and the commercial arm of ISRO, the Indian Space Agency. So history was made. It was like breaking down a mini Berlin Wall. It took us a good 5 years. And then the satellite was launched in 2016, and Google bought Skybox. So we launched a Google satellite on the PSLV rocket, and the world came full circle. So that the soft diplomacy that we did opened the doors for other American companies to launch satellites on the PSLV rocket. I won't say the door is wide open, but it's ajar. Space is a complicated place to be given the export control regimes, the regulatory hurdles. So if you remember in 2017, February, I think India launched 104 satellites on the PSLV rocket, which was a world record. 96 of those satellites were American. And that wouldn't have happened had it not been Earth to orbit and Skybox jostling with all the hurdles that came our way to make it happen. And after that, we decided to move on, we meaning Earth to orbit, we decided to move on, and we engaged in what we call Earth observation analytics for 3 years. What that means is you take satellite imagery, so the images of the Earth taken from Earth observation satellites. You take these images using different sensors. They're optical sensors, they're radar, and you then build computer models for downstream applications here on Earth. It could be for any sector. It could be for urban planning. It could be for resource management. It could be for climate, making cities climate smart, for agriculture, for fisheries. Every single sector can use space or satellite imagery to solve problems for that sector. So my company, Earth to Orbit, we worked in 2 broad areas. One was agriculture. So we used open source satellite imagery from a European constellation of satellites called Sentinel to design models to forecast the yield for the rice crop and the wheat crop. So for the Kharif season and the Rabi season. Because this kind of forecasting can help in many different ways. It could help with pricing. It could help with farmers getting their insurance in case of the yield being below the expected average or whatever it is. So we worked really the idea was to leverage the advances in machine learning and analytics and combine it with space imagery to create models for agriculture. And we also looked at computer models for making cities climate smart. For example, if I'm given a certain neighborhood in Bangalore, I can use satellite imagery and tell you which rooftops in that area would be conducive or would be good for rooftop horticulture or for harvesting solar energy. Just a random example. So anyway, that's what we did for 3 years. After the first 7 years was spent in, you could say, facilitating international launches on the PSLV. So I went from working in human space exploration to literally, getting a satellite to come to India to be integrated onto the top of our PSLV rocket and be launched into outer space. I think it's like I said, I don't like silos, right? So I've gone from that. And now, after the pandemic, I completely shifted gears and co-founded a space think tank called Spaceport Sarabhai. It has a very unique structure. It's headquartered out of Bangalore, but we have the co-founding team is based in multiple countries. We have someone in Berlin, someone in Madrid, someone in Washington, D.C., someone in Japan, someone in Delhi. So it's a small bunch of international space professionals. We are all Indians. And the objective of starting the space think tank at this point in time is that ever since I moved back to India in 2008, I had made several trips to New Delhi to meet ministers and bureaucrats over time to convince them that we need to liberalize the Indian space economy. What I mean by that is that India has a fantastic government space program, very accomplished government space program. But we need to liberalize the space economy. In other words, we need to allow private companies to play a greater role, not only in serving the needs and the mandate of the Indian Space Agency, but also become part of the international space marketplace. Annually, the civilian side of space technology and applications, the global revenues are somewhere around 400 billion US dollars, right? This doesn't include defense, just the civil side, the civilian side of things. So I want Indian companies, both old and new, to be able to play in that international, to be able to compete and play in that international space marketplace. So the idea of the space think tank came about because we thought it's time that we have a think tank that does sort of rigorous research and is able to give policy guidance to the government so that they can come up with policy that's based on evidence and data and stakeholder input, and not just sort of ad hoc policy making. So that's one focus of the think tank. The other one is we need to make sure that India has a very strong international voice. What I mean by that is there are many international fora, right? There's the United Nations, there are other think tanks around the world. So as we move forward in terms of exploring and inhabiting, outer space, so low Earth orbit is now a very busy orbit. We use that a lot for Earth observation satellites, for broadband satellites, but it's also getting very cluttered. The space debris has now reached dangerous levels in low Earth orbit. We have more than 300 million man-made objects in low Earth orbit, anything from dead satellites to paint chips to upper stages of rockets. So how do we deal with that clutter? We need to bring in regulations. We need to bring in laws. Or how do we figure out the legal environment that should govern lunar exploration in the near future? Because everybody's going to show up on the moon. So we need to make sure that India is in the driving seat. It sort of leads from the front. When these matters of consequence and the legal regime, which will have far-reaching consequences, are being crafted. So that's the second objective. So make sure that India has a leading voice in the international play, the space and law area. And the third one is, of course, we would love to see India become a developed space economy by 2030 or thereabouts. What I mean by that is our companies should have captured a significant, or at least a respectable chunk of this $400 billion pie, is what I'm trying to say, because that'll also generate amazing new employment in the country, meaningful employment, right? Just to give you an example, a prime, like a large US aerospace company, like a Boeing or a Lockheed Martin, employs anywhere from about, some 150,000 people, right? By contrast, a space agency, I think NASA, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but let's take ISRO's numbers. The space agency employs 16,000 people, 16,000 people, right? Whereas a large space company can easily employ 100,000 people. A smaller space company can maybe employ anywhere from 30 to 100 to 500 people. So I think it's very important that economy, just like we have the IT industry, which employs millions, the space, the potential, like I think in one of my policy pieces, I had written that India is sitting on a space gold mine.
Yes.
We are one of 5 countries or one of 7 countries in the world that does what it does in outer space. We have our rockets, we build satellites, we have amazing slew of applications, and now we are doing human space exploration and robotic planetary exploration. So there is no reason for us to not have a thriving space industry. So that's the objective too with our space think tank.
Amazing, amazing. Now, you covered a bunch of questions which I had already in mind. In fact, I was going to talk about the 2017 article that you wrote, India is sitting on a space gold mine. But I guess that deserves a separate Audiogyan session altogether.
Yeah, because really, the opportunities are immense.
Correct.
So if any of you who are listening to the podcast are interested in outer space, you need to figure out, what is it that interests you? Are you interested in building rockets? Are you interested in using satellites for applications here on Earth? Or are you interested in designing the next space habitat? Or are you interested in astrophysics and astronomy? There's so much you can do.
Yeah. And also looking at the body of work and the wide spectrum that you have done, I have last 2 questions just to sort of wrap this up. Is that you also encourage a lot of entrepreneurs and practitioners, especially who want to venture into this field, to look at Earth from a 400-kilometer kind of a distance, which is above this in the atmosphere. So, and plus working with closely with ISRO, NASA, ESA. Any big learnings that you want to just share, which could be, obviously all this while has been very inspirational, but just to articulate in this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I for the longest time I was encouraging people to look at Earth from 400 kilometers because that's where the International Space Station flies, roughly. But lately, after our moon landing, I'm starting to encourage them to look at Earth from the moon. And there are some beautiful high definition videos that were shot by the Japanese satellite lunar orbiter called Kaguya in 2008 or 2009. So if you want to see what the Earth rise and the Earth set looks from the moon, because you literally see a blue marble coming up into the horizon, and then the Earth set happens, just like you see moon rise and moon set, right, from Earth. I mean, so I always like to say that space is not just about technology, about applications, about business, about social impact, about geopolitics, but most importantly, it's about perspective. You might have read many an astronaut saying that I saw our planet, home planet, from outer space, and it looked beautiful and it looked fragile. But I would like to quote two people who have given a counter perspective, and one of them is a French astronaut called Jean-Francois Clairvoy, who said, no, the Earth is not fragile. It's we who are fragile. The Earth will go on. Nature will go on. It's we who will perish if we make our planet uninhabitable. I think he flips the perspective, you see. There's another perspective, a recent one, from William Shatner, who was Captain Kirk in Star Trek Enterprise. I grew up with Star Trek and Cosmos. In Sundays, we used to have these TV broadcasts. So Captain Kirk of Starship Enterprise is a Canadian actor called William Shatner, who's now, I believe, close to 90 or so. He flew on the Blue Shepard, which is the Blue Origin rocket. It was 2 years ago, I think. And when he got to the edge of space, which is about 100 kilometers from the Earth, from the surface of the Earth, and he has said this after he came back, and he looked at this vast expanse of darkness and nothingness. It struck him as death, as a void, as like darkness. And he said that made him realize how precious our home planet is. Because we can romanticize exploration as much as we want. But the reality is, if I were to put you in a capsule and ship you off to Mars or even into interstellar space, you will just spend days and months and years in absolute pitch darkness, maybe with just a few flickering stars. And it's not going to be great psychologically. It'll really do things to your mind that you can't even imagine. So I think William Shatner saying that it felt like death. He didn't romanticize it at all. And he said, that's what made me realize that we have a warm, fuzzy home down there with the beauty that we see around us. So please don't forget to take care of the planet. So, a slightly different perspective rather than the broad brush stroke, fragile Earth and beautiful Earth perspective.
Yeah.
So I think I'll leave you with that imagery in your mind. So yeah, I think it really is about perspective.
Amazing. And any tip from a designer's lens, just like a last concluding line?
I think from a designer lens, I would encourage people to go travel to the Arctic or to Antarctica or to the big grand desert that's nearest to you. Like it could be Kutch, it could be Thar, it could be the Mongolian desert, and live off the land, live off that geography without too much outside intervention, without too much human intervention, technology. I mean, try to see how you can live in these extreme environments with as little as possible. And also experience the psychological impact of living in these extreme environments. It's very difficult to describe what happens to your mind. You can see the Russian film Solaris. It has a bit of a glimpse of that. So yeah, so as a designer, I would want to encourage people, whether you are a designer or not, to go and spend a good chunk of time, at least a couple of weeks, if not more, in isolated extreme environments with very little input and interaction and connection to the outside world, and see how it goes. I mean, that will transform you for life. And that will also be a great start if you want to venture into designing things for extreme environments.
Amazing. Okay, just the thing, like I have all the time for you. You have any more time? Should we continue, or like we'll conclude in this?
I think we
Depending
can
on your
stop. Yeah, I think we can stop recording and have a little chat, post podcast chat now, and then call it a day, because I have a lot of work to do before I fly off to
correct.
Switzerland on Tuesday.
Yeah. That's why I was like cautious about your time. Otherwise, this is very fascinating. Okay, I'll just conclude.
And next time I'm in Singapore, I'll come meet you, so you don't
Yes,
feel like,
we'll book a studio and just chat for like whatever time we are together. Okay.
So let's wrap up the podcast
Yeah.
and then have a quick offline chat, and then
Cool. Okay. Cool. I think I don't know. I like Sushmita. You can just keep talking, and I have a lot of questions, and it's just a very fascinating new subject for me also. And when we talk about humanities, when we talk about us, as George Carlin said, like a blue marble floating in the sky, like in nowhere actually. It feels very, very fascinating. But on that note, we can conclude this. I would like to have you again on Audiogyan, talk about more details from a designer's lens. And I think thanks for giving your time. It was really amazing.
Yeah, it was wonderful for me as well, Kedar. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And that's it from today's GAN session. And that's it from today's GAN session. For show notes and more GAN, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.